Hello, good morning. I'm Andrew Guile. I'm a solicitor and a director here at GN Law, and welcome to our In Conversation series. This morning I am with my colleague Luke Cowles.
Hi.
And my colleague Hazel Metcalfe.
Hello.
Who are both solicitors here with me in the Police Actions Department. Now this morning what we're going to look at is an issue that's arisen out of a government tender that took place in August of this year, and that tender involved outsourcing a lot of the bailiff work, or all of the bailiff work that's currently done by courts. So to give you a brief example, it's a situation where someone has a court fine against them and they don't pay it, and a bailiff is turning up at their house perhaps to take their TV or other goods in their house. And at the moment that is done in part by the courts, but in part by private companies, which we're going to hear about from Luke and Hazel. But in the media recently, there's been a lot of furore about it being passed on to G4S and Serco, in that they bidded for these contracts. We don't know the outcome of the contracts as I understand it at the moment, but there's a great deal of concern about what will happen if those two companies are involved to a greater extent in those sorts of activities, and including the power to arrest people and things like that.
Certainly with G4S, people get worried because G4S have got a lot of contracts from the government over the years, so it would be less surprising if they were to win this contract as well, because that's generally quite a common formula for them.
Yeah, so I'm going to really hand over to Luke and Hazel, who've been doing the research around this topic, and we'll be looking at the realities of the situation and trying to bring you viewers a bit more, make you a bit more informed about exactly the extent to which you should be worried about this development. So over to you guys. What have you found?
Well, obviously the main concerns around G4S are their history, and one of the main problems that they've experienced in their contracts is when they made up offenders that they were tagging and charged the government for it, basically.
Yeah, this is one of the recent. So anyone watching this video will probably remember some of these stories in the media, because the concern is it's not just necessarily should the government be outsourcing these powers, but should they be outsourcing them to someone like G4S?
Yes. So the quality of the individual that is actually obtaining the contract in the first place.
And the company that's controlling the actual individuals who physically turn up at the door and knock on the door.
And certainly it's not lost on us, like you mentioned just now, that G4S, as well as Serco, in terms of, let's say, the public's view of them, it's generally pretty poor because of things like their looking after prisons and lots of issues going on with that, and you can speak a bit about that in a minute. And a lot of people remember G4S for the Olympics fiasco, which is not that long ago, where they were contracted out to provide security, didn't provide enough staff, and ultimately the government ends up having to bring in, I think it was like 3,000 troops or something in terms of the army, which is, just
pretty
it's
shocking.
farcical, especially when you've got a world event and you're trying to show the world, how lovely and organised you are, and that's, ultimately what happens.
So what evidence was there against them in your tagging case?
They were charging for tagging more offenders than they were actually tagging, so they're overcharging.
Exactly,
Right.
and some of them, I think the issues were the individual was in prison, so therefore not on a tag, and charges were being put forward, and then I think, and I'm not 100% certain, but I think in some cases either the individual may have been deceased, and so again, but either way there were some clear situations where the individual was not on a tag, charges being put forward, and it reminds me a little bit of job centre issues where they've had recruitment companies come in, private contracts, and I think it's only a few years ago, they were charging for allegedly helping certain amounts of people get jobs or seeing them consultations. I think it was Rec4 Limited.
Okay.
And they, and that's the issue, I think, certainly with the arguments as to public functions being carried out by private companies, and what is the actual objective of that individual. So private companies, generically, obviously they tend to be profit driven. That's what makes them a business, keeps them a going concern. But G4S certainly, especially with prisons, and you obviously dealt with some prisons which are...
Yeah, so it's also concerns about the levels of regulation within that private company. So Medway Secure Detention Centre, which was a detention centre for children, was actually taken off G4S by the government because of the failings and the abuse that happened there. So there was a panorama.
Yeah.
This was the panorama undercover, when
Yes.
they were dragging them around the floor and...
Yeah. Exactly. So the concerns about the use of force there will also be concerns when they're exercising warrants to for fines or by exercising arrest.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, one of the articles that I read in one of the tabloids, I can't remember which one, was saying that one of the concerns is that at the moment, court-based staff, one would hope, would just view it as a job, and they turn up at the front door and somebody might say, well, look, I have this excuse for not paying my fine, or give me a bit more time, or whatever. And it certainly came across to me in reading that article, you might want to say whether or not my assumptions are correct, is that the indication was that the bailiff has some sort of discretion in terms of whether or not they actually pile on into the house and enforce something. And the belief is that the way the system operates at the moment involves a degree of discretion and a degree of humanity in turning up and someone says, look, I'm really sorry, my mum's just died. I haven't been in the country, I've been off in somewhere else where they might be from parents might be somewhere else around the world. And they say, okay, fine, you can have another 7 days or 14 days or something like this. But the fear is that G4S will turn up, and we have concerns from the examples that you've given of the quality of the staff that G4S has.
And it depends on that. And how their payment system's going to work. Because like
that's the point, isn't it? It's incentives.
With the discretion, yeah.
Will G4S or Serco staff turning up to try and recover money be more concerned about their target for that month, whether they've recovered £10,000 or whatever, such that will the humanity leave the doorstep, as it were?
And imagine almost a situation where, by turning up and trying to initially obtain some money triggers a level 1 fee. If the alleged offender is supposed to have resisted and that ends up leading to an arrest or use of force, that triggers a level 2 fee. That's an issue where arrest is actually almost something, in terms of profit, perhaps, and I'm not suggesting that this should happen, but managers could encourage to be a bit more free and open about it.
They might actually prompt, or there might be a fear that... I mean, I can see your point. Sorry, I'll come back in just a sec, but I can see your point, because I suppose it is logical that under a contract with the government they will be paid more for doing more.
Well,
so if they do have to arrest somebody, then they're naturally going to get paid more.
I think it's important to point out here that there are private companies already with these powers. So private companies do have the power to arrest in these situations already. It's not going to be a new power. And so it's in certain situations that they can arrest. It's not that they're just going to be able to come around and if you don't pay the fine, they'll be able to arrest you. They can only arrest you when there is a warrant for committing. So it wouldn't be that they just have unlimited powers.
Exactly, like you say, the court has to give out, or I suppose give a certain warrant in the first place. So there is a certain level of power already given by the court, but I think, depending on how, dare I say, the fee structure, and I'm sure that fee structure already exists, like you mentioned, this isn't a new power that's rolling out. It's the issue is about these two specific companies, and there are others, but these are the ones that tend to be A, the biggest companies, and B, have some of the more negative light against them. We agree with that for certain reasons. I mean, certainly with prisons, like you mentioned, in terms of fee structures, there's been issues where, on the one hand, there's just epic amounts of drugs being brought into prisons, according to sort of some of the journalists. And from a if you're a private company, on the one hand, sort of catching people, putting those statistics forward is a good thing, sure, in terms of a public sort of sphere, but then they were going to get fines and penalties if they catch too many in a month, because it suggests their security is too lax. And there were certainly allegations that they were purposely not looking for drugs, because that would then in turn mean they're sending the government statistics of, oh, we're looking after your prison and these 20,000 incidents happened over the last year or something. So purposely trying to keep that number reduced, so it gives a false impression about how much drugs there really is, and B, it ultimately has a financial aspect to it, which is ultimately key in terms of how they perform their job.
So there are criticisms of the current private companies that
I was interested in that. So what information do we have about how it's currently operating?
Well, there's concerns because the way people see this is that a lot of the time when you're enforcing, the bailiffs are enforcing the fines or the warrants for arrest, they are dealing with some of the most vulnerable in society, because they are the people that end up in this situation.
We get into that trouble,
And as you said, there are meant to be ways that they deal with this. So they're not meant to come to the house between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. They're meant to give you time to deal with it if someone there is definitely vulnerable. So if they are clearly suffering from mental illness, or if they've had a recent bereavement. And there is a report in March 2017 which was taking control, the need for fundamental bailiff reform, and that explored that the private companies were not taking these elements into consideration as well as the civilian enforcement teams.
And that's a good point, because like you said about vulnerable people, debt is a hugely problematic issue across the board for generically vulnerable people to be in debt, not be able to pay it, and it's a very distressing event having a bailiff come up to your house and pretty much trying to enforce debts upon you, which we're not going to go into necessarily the roundabout of it, but if you can't pay your debts, there is that balance between having someone who's going to be a bit more approachable about it, and I know these are bailiffs, so we can't completely live in sort of a sort of fairyland, but there is that balance of you are dealing with people and the sort of situations that some of these people find them in. There's no harm in a bit of humanity about it either.
I think that, again, going back to my impression from the recent media coverage, that the media seemed to be unaware, at least it wasn't getting reported, that these powers did already exist and were being operated by private companies already. It came across as, look, this is this massive change, G4S are going to have powers of arrest, and that this is a disaster. I mean, it may well be a disaster, but we can clarify here in conversation that it's nothing new.
No.
It does seem to be a rollout such that local courts will no longer have any internal bailiff procedures. It will all be outsourced to private companies. So it's been small scale at the moment, and it's now going big scale. But the powers of arrest come from a court.
Yes.
This is not at the discretion of G4S staff.
No.
But we seem to be saying that we still, nevertheless, because of the examples with the problems that they've caused, we're still very concerned, and the way it's been pitched in the media is certainly not without good cause. We do have concerns regarding the control, the quality, the training, and the approach that these staff will take from looking at your March report. If independent companies without the bad track record of G4S have been accused, or the statistics seem to suggest that they're not exercising their discretion to be a bit more humane on people's doorsteps, then what are people going to be in for with G4S or Serco?
I mean, like you said, the Magistrates Court Act does already set out powers that already exist, where private companies ultimately can sort of be a civilian enforcement officer, which includes a number of powers that are already in existence, one of them being arrest. But like you said, the quality, the training, and perhaps the openness or scrutiny that they're going to have, because, you know, by nature, you know, public entities, pretty much there's very little they can do that won't get found out or seen, reports and the internal workings of that public authority. Whereas with private companies, there's always an element of possibly shadiness as to what they necessarily have to give in terms of, you know, the work they're doing, but necessarily what's happening in the sort of boardrooms, what's happening in the back level, the sort of discussions behind closed doors, and the amount that we'll know versus the amount that we won't necessarily know about.
It's probably important to add, in case anyone watching this is interested, is that just because these are private companies,
yes,
as they will be exercising a power of the state granted to them by the state, by the court with a warrant for arrest, they are going to be subject to being sued as if they were the state.
Under legal aid as well, it will be covered.
So anything they do wrong, any assaults, any wrongful exercise of their powers or failure to properly exercise their discretion will be something that people can bring an action for.
Yes.
So that they're open to that as well. They're certainly not immune from that sort of action. Is there anything else coming out of your research that you think we can helpfully add into this in conversation?
Certainly from my point of view, I think the major issues are largely covered in terms of the sort of, you know, the media is generally talking about concerns about these specific companies and it being broadened to allow them to now have powers, and given the sort of track history that they have, people's worry about how they will specifically implement powers that already exist. You know, are they capable of doing it? Will it lead to more problems, given, you know, what they've already managed to do in terms of prisons and notorious problems with that? You mentioned about the tagging, and, you know, that ultimately costs the taxpayer more unless we uncover it, but otherwise simply it's just, you know, it's big money and big bills.
And these aren't only concerns raised by the media, there are also concerns raised by other politicians. So there's been motions brought by other politicians regarding this matter because they are concerned about these companies and concerned about these public functions being privatised.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found the video helpful. There are other videos in this In Conversation series that you might want to watch and you might find equally helpful. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like and feel free to share it. Thank you very much for joining us.